Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for tuning in to the GSMC Football Podcast. I am your host, as always, Matthew Quinn. We're brought to you once again by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We'll be covering some NFL news, some rumors, some things that happened today. There were a few things that happened, some contracts, and some players being made available. So we'll go into that a little bit in the first segment there. And then later in the show, we're going to be talking more about our season outlooks. We're going to be covering the rest of the AFC South, which our last team is the Indianapolis Colts. So we'll be wrapping that division up. And then we'll be starting with the AFC East in our final two segments of the show with the Miami Dolphins and then, of course, the New York Jets to wrap everything up. Make sure you stick around for later in the show. I'm going to give you my record predictions for each one of those season outlooks. Obviously, like I always say, it's very, very early, so that could change, from now until, training camp or even after the draft, it could change. But before we go ahead and get started with all of that, I would just like to ask you guys that you like and follow the show. Anything helps us out in terms of tips and donations. If you've got a question that you want to ask during the show, we definitely want to hear it as well. And in order to do that, all you'll have to do is just go and knock out our super chats. And whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion you have to share, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there's an easy way to do that. Use the super chat feature, just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send in your super chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support, so just keep bringing all of your comments and questions, and we'll keep bringing you all the sports content that you love, and we appreciate every single bit of it. So just go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that super chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and exciting as possible. And if you prefer, you can also go to gsmcsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or question there. We couldn't do what we do without you guys' amazing support, so we're so thankful to have you as part of our community. So once again, the link is gsmcpodcast.net. Now let's go ahead and get into everything today. Our first segment that we're going to be covering is just some news that happened today. There are a few things. If you were paying attention to what was going on in the NFL, there was a couple things. One of the big moves that happened was the Bears trading for Chiefs All-Pro guard Joe Thuney. They traded for a fourth-round pick for him, so they kind of got him for a pretty good deal, and that just adds on to the list of things that the Bears are trying to do to improve that offensive line, because they also went out and they got Rams offensive lineman Jonah Jackson. He was a Pro Bowler last year. So obviously they're trying to put the emphasis on protecting Caleb Williams, and rightfully so. He's a young quarterback, and there's been such a history in Chicago of quarterbacks that just have not panned out just simply because they haven't been really surrounded with the best, team or coaches. They're hoping that with the new head coach in Ben Johnson and some of his staff and, some fresh talent coming in, that they can maybe turn things around in Chicago like they wanted to last year, but obviously that just didn't really work out for them. So that was one of the things that happened today. So the Bears are definitely looking like they're trying to be a little bit aggressive here in the offseason. Definitely a position of need for the Bears. They gave up a lot of sacks last year. We'll get further into details of what the Bears' overall stats were last season once we cover them in our season outlook a little bit later in the week, or maybe in a couple weeks, depending on how long that takes and depending on how much news comes out, between now and then. There could be a lot of things with free agency right around the corner. There's going to be a lot of signings, a lot of things to talk about. So we'll get to that, once we get to the Bears. But another thing that happened today was the franchise tag deadline. Only 2 players were tagged. That's actually the fewest since 1994. And it was Chiefs offensive lineman Trey Smith. And then, of course, the, one that's been in the headlines a lot is T. Higgins with Cincinnati. Another interesting thing that happened today is Max Crosby. Max Crosby of the Raiders, he became the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL. He signed a 3-year, $106.5 million deal to stay with the Raiders. And, that's not really surprising with a guy of that caliber. There was talk last year, I didn't really think too much of it. There was talk last year that he could potentially want out after the Raiders just didn't really seem to do anything, and they just kind of crashed out last year towards the end of the year. But he's, a Raider at heart. I really can't imagine him playing for anybody else. Just the way that he plays just screams Raiders, So him getting that extension, is well earned, well deserved, and not really surprising of a guy of that talent, One of the best defensive players in all of football. He's always, a force, even if the Raiders are not very good, which they haven't necessarily been very good over the past several years, but Max Crosby has always been very, very good. So, good for him, well deserved. Couple other things that happened. The Seahawks, they were in the news for a couple of reasons. One, the 10-year Seahawks veteran Tyler Lockett was released today, so that just adds to another line in the growing list of wide receivers that are going to be available outside of the NFL draft. So that large, it's growing larger and larger. A lot of really good players are becoming available. Speaking of Seahawks receivers, DK Metcalf has also requested a trade from Seattle. So that would leave Seattle with just Jackson, Smith, and Jigba, for their main weapon, really, and they would have to dip into the free agency pool themselves, most likely, or possibly in the draft or something like that. Or maybe they do one of the trades of one of the receivers that are, making themselves available. Cooper Kupp comes to mind in that regard. He'd probably be relatively cheap for the Seahawks to try and acquire. And he's still a pretty solid receiver too. But DK Metcalf requesting a trade, got to figure that he's going to at least carry about a second rounder, maybe even a first rounder, because he is 27 years old, and this was only his sixth year this past year. So he's still relatively young. So they could, push for possibly a first rounder if DK wants to walk away from Seattle. Wouldn't surprise me. I'd probably see, if I was a GM, I'd see if I could, do away with a second round pick and maybe a player or something like that, or maybe an additional pick to try and get him. But, you may end up having to pay at least the first rounder for DK Metcalf. And he would be worth it. He's a very, very good receiver even now. He may not have had the greatest numbers this past year with Geno Smith as the quarterback, but he's proven in the past, back when Russell Wilson was still the quarterback for Seattle, that he could be a playmaker and a really, really good, receiver on the outside. A couple teams I could think of that could absolutely use a guy like DK Metcalf. Dallas Cowboys, which is kind of one that I haven't really heard many people talk about, but pair DK Metcalf up with CeeDee Lamb, that could be a really, really good offense with Dak Prescott there. And, say what you want about Dak Prescott, he still is a talented quarterback. He just hasn't really had the success in the playoffs that, he has wanted. And obviously that's the team that everyone loves to hate, So anytime that he doesn't do anything or the Cowboys don't do anything, it gets magnified more so than, just about any other team in the NFL. So it's a little off track, but, DK Metcalf, I could see going to Dallas. Another team that could potentially go after DK Metcalf would be the Chargers. They need some receiver help outside of Quentin Johnston. They haven't really been able to replace a guy like Keenan Allen once he departed to Chicago last year. They were kind of hoping that it would just be Johnston that would be able to step up, and he did play better than his rookie year, but he's still, that's not the guy. He's not your number one receiver in my mind, especially if you can go and get a guy like DK Metcalf. That would make him that much better. And DK would make any team better, or at least any of team's receivers room better, no matter where he goes. I could also see him going to Pittsburgh potentially. The Steelers are obviously in need of wide receiver help outside of George Pickens, and that would be a very nice combination. If George Pickens can, grow up a little bit, this year and the contract year that he's going to be in, maybe he could benefit from having a guy like DK Metcalf to go up against, or to compete with in practice, not just in games and stuff, compete for the quarterback's attention, no matter who the quarterback is, so that's something that could potentially push him, and it would be a really good depth piece for the Steelers to have if they added a guy like DK Metcalf. Receiver is a big need for them, so it's not just DK that could be available. They could even go after Tyler Lockett as well, now that Tyler Lockett is a free agent, as well as some other guys that were free agents, such as Christian Kirk being released by the Jaguars today. That's another guy. He was in Jacksonville for about 3 years, but he kind of had an injury-plagued year last year. Still a talented receiver, but you do worry about that injury history and him getting closer to 30 in the age and everything. So he is just another receiver in that, like I said, growing list of receivers that are becoming more and more available, as the offseason progresses and as we get closer to free agency. So there's a lot of guys out there, and a lot of teams that really need receiver help. So it's going to be an interesting, week or so as, you look to see a lot of these receivers or guys that are trying to go somewhere else probably will get scooped up here, pretty quickly, or you'll start hearing more stories about deals getting done. So, something to look forward to. It's always an exciting time in a relatively dry part of the news cycle for the NFL, but still a lot of things happening. Just one thing I feel like I should mention also is the Bengals defensive end, Sam Hubbard, has been a solid player for them since he was drafted. He is actually retiring after just 7 seasons, which kind of came as a little bit of a surprise to me. It's 7 years in the league. It's typically guys, they retire at least getting close to 10 or after 10 years. So 7 years is a little on the early side, but, congratulations to him, and wish him well in retirement. He was a very good player for Cincinnati. He didn't really reach where they wanted to go. Obviously they did go to the Super Bowl, but didn't reach that ultimate goal of winning it. So that is kind of a bummer on his career, but still had a good career with Cincinnati, solid player. So wish him the best of luck in his retirement. Couple other things just before we finish here. The Eagles signed Zach Bond to a 3-year extension. Of course, he was one of the key pieces to that defense and how good they were last year. So, not really a surprise that they wanted to get him locked down. So he signed that $51 million deal. It's $34 million guaranteed in it as well. So good job there for the Eagles locking him down. That's just another one of their, really good defensive pieces that they don't have to worry about now for at least another 3 years, So, and he's going to grow into an even better player. He was really, really good last year. There was even talk that he could be like a dark horse for Defensive Player of the Year. Obviously didn't end up working out in his favor, but, he got the ultimate goal, which was a Super Bowl championship in a game in which he did play really well, which, was no secret because he played well all year and was an All-Pro. So well deserving of that contract. But, so those are just about a few things that happened today. Kind of a busy, news day, for the most part. Nothing really crazy happening. The record-breaking contract from Max Crosby, probably the biggest news outside of the trade between the Bears and Chiefs. But, this pretty dry cycle of news, but we're going to be ramping up here in the next few days as we get closer to free agency. So before we go ahead and get into the next segment, we're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back, and we're going to get into some of our season outlooks, wrapping up the AFC South, and then continuing on with the AFC East. So we will be right back. Stay with us.
Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me
wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit, I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant, I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
All right, guys, welcome on back to the GSMC Football Podcast. Before we get into the second segment of our show, just want to give you a quick reminder that anything that you guys want to talk about, any comments or questions that you guys might want to, make yourself heard about, just go ahead and hit our super chat. It is the GSMC Sports Network or GSMCsports.net, and go ahead and type in any of your questions or comments. Anything that you guys say is greatly appreciated, any feedback. And obviously it's, fun to get into little debates and, with some of the questions that we may get in. So encourage that for sure. But let's go ahead and get into the next part of our show. We are going to go ahead and finish our AFC South season outlook. This time we're going to be talking about the Indianapolis Colts and what they did last year. Just a quick refresher on how their season went. They finished 8-9, finished second in the AFC South. Their offense was pretty inconsistent for most of the year. A lot of questions still surround Anthony Richardson. There were times where he had to be benched throughout the course of the year just because he was struggling. Had one of the worst completion percentages in NFL history by a quarterback. It was Tim Tebow there for a while, and then Anthony Richardson overtook that infamous record. So definitely a lot of improvement there. The thing with Anthony Richardson, and me being a Gators fan, I followed Anthony Richardson when he was in college, and it was always kind of the same knock on him, in college, was that he has all of the physical abilities, all the physical tools that you would look for in like a really physical kind of quarterback. Kind of puts you in the mind of Cam Newton a little bit, how he played. He has all of those physical talents, but he is not great at his decision making. And another thing is whenever he has a play that breaks down or goes bad, it gets in his head a little bit, and then he kind of struggles. If he throws an interception early in the game, chances are he's going to probably throw another one before the game is over, because he's not necessarily great at bouncing back from negative plays. That could come with time, because he has all of the physical abilities there. It could come with coaching. He could get better. They have a solid coaching staff with Shane Steichen in Indianapolis, but they're not seeing what they want to see or what they need to see from Anthony Richardson. And this coming year is going to be a very, very crucial year in his development. If he does not show something, they could be looking, elsewhere. It's possible that they could go after a quarterback to push Anthony Richardson this offseason. Wouldn't surprise me if they did that. Don't know if they're going to draft a quarterback. It's in the first round anyway, because there's a lot of other holes in this team. Maybe they get a quarterback in day 2 or 3 to maybe come in, or maybe they get a veteran guy to come in and try and push Anthony Richardson. Maybe Anthony Richardson sits behind a guy like Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, for a year or something, just to learn a little bit. And maybe they go that route, It's really going to depend on Anthony Richardson and how he looks throughout training camp. And then, of course, in the preseason leading into the regular season, because he'll have these games where he'll throw some incredible passes, but then he'll throw some incredibly dumb interceptions. And it's an up and down sort of player. You've got to really kind of hone those talents that he has, and maybe, try and limit as much as you can some of the mistakes and some of the bad habits that he has as a young quarterback. But young quarterback, like I said, so there's still potential there, and there's still time for him to grow and become a much better quarterback than what he has been since he got drafted out of Florida a couple years ago. But looking at the rest of the offense, they still have one of the best running backs in the league in Jonathan Taylor. There was a little bit of a contract dispute last year in the offseason with them. They were able to at least put a Band-Aid on that. I'm sure it's going to come up again in the next year or so, because I believe it was only about like a 2 or 3 year deal that they signed him to, just to get him back on the field. But he's still a quality running back. The team overall in rushing weren't too bad. They were 8th in the league, so top 10 in rushing. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with Jonathan Taylor, but also Anthony Richardson does have the ability to run the ball, so he used that as a threat in some of the games that he did actually play. So that, inflated their numbers a little bit as well. But in passing, they were only 25th in the league. So they were near the bottom of the league. And the combination of Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco, who had to come in relief of Richardson a few times, just didn't really get the job done. Flacco had a lot of success, of course, when he was in Baltimore, and some success when he was in Cleveland for those, that half season that he was there. And, he was putting forth some pretty good performances. Colts were kind of looking forward to maybe having that same thing happen to them when they signed Joe Flacco and decided to put him in as the starter. They were hoping they could catch some of that magic that he had in Cleveland, but just didn't really work out. He had a couple pretty solid games, but, for the most part, he was never really going to get them where they wanted to go. That was just a situation where they needed to plug somebody in there to maybe try and motivate Anthony Richardson. And, of course, Anthony Richardson was hurt a lot, and that's been another knock on him since he came into the league, is he has been hurt a lot and hasn't really played a full season. I mean, he's only been in the league. This was his second year, so just going into his third year, and he hasn't played a full season yet. And as a young quarterback, and you haven't played a full season, and you are the team starter, you're not like learning behind somebody, that's alarming. You want to get experience in there so that he can break some of these bad habits that he has. But outside of, offense, because, we're talking a lot about quarterback with the Colts, but, it is, rightfully so, because that is their biggest question mark ultimately, is what's going to happen with Anthony Richardson. But as far as defensively, they were hoping that they were going to be solid. They've typically been solid defensively, but last year just was not one of those years in which they were. They gave up just over 361 yards per game. That was close to last, 29th in the league overall out of 32 teams. So not where you want to be defensively. They were 26th in the league in points per game allowed. They allowed about 25 points per game last year. Not where you want to be, of course. So there's a lot of holes that they need to fix in this offseason with the draft and free agency. There's, turnovers is a big issue with the Colts as well. They have to cut down on those turnovers. Anthony Richardson alone had 15 turnovers, 11 interceptions, and 4 fumbles, I believe. But still, you can't get much wins. You can't get many wins, when you play like that. So they need to do something about that, of course, going into next year. Defensively, they could bolster some of the, spots on defense. There's a couple guys that are probably going to be cap casualties. So if you take a look at what they need this year in the offseason, receiver room is another thing that they could potentially want to bolster. You've got Michael Pittman there right now. He, didn't necessarily have a huge year last year, but he's still, basically their number one guy. You may see them potentially go after one of these free agent receivers that we mentioned in the earlier segment, whether it be via trade with Cooper Kupp, DK Metcalf, whatever one of those guys. They could potentially land a receiver to get some help to Michael Pittman Jr. and, bolster that, whoever it is that they decide to put behind the line of scrimmage to be the quarterback. They are definitely going to need some weapons. Another weapon that they could potentially look towards, maybe even in the draft, is the tight end position. Warren out of Penn State has been linked to the Colts a number of times from things that I have read or watched on online and everything, and it wouldn't be too, out of the realm of possibility for the Colts to go that way. They've had a history with solid tight ends, going back to when they had Peyton Manning still at the helm. Dallas Clark was one of the best tight ends, in the game at that point. And, of course, Andrew Luck had a couple of guys too. Mo Alley Cox has been solid, not been, anything like a George Kittle or a Travis Kelce, anything like that. But he's been, a decent tight end for them. But that could be something that they look at maybe trying to improve upon, because there's not many tight ends in free agency, that they could potentially go after and get. It's a very deep tight end class in the draft. So even if they don't get one in the first round, they could go after, a tight end at some point. I would expect them to definitely draft a tight end at some point in the draft. Just with how deep the class is, they would be silly not to go that route, because that is a position of need for them as well. Defensive line is something that they could go after, as we've talked about, in numerous occasions to this point, how deep the defensive line class is in the draft this year. It's definitely something that they could look at. Wouldn't be surprised if they address that in the very first round. Offensive line, they could use some help there. Obviously Anthony Richardson didn't do himself any favors in terms of sacks, just from, the way that he plays. He does run the ball, so he, moves around a lot, and he's a young quarterback, so he can run into sacks or hold on to the ball for too long. So, but the offensive line is still, not where it needs to be. There's a couple of guys that are going to be free agents, so they may have to just sign some different guys and bolster that offensive line by default, just because they're, potentially losing some guys. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. I know I mentioned that they could potentially bring in a veteran to push Anthony Richardson, a guy that, I mentioned before, but Russell Wilson, I think, could be an interesting proposition for them, because they could get him for relatively cheap and still be able to bolster the rest of the team. So that's something to look into. Don't think they'll go after a guy like Aaron Rodgers. I think there's just too much baggage with Aaron Rodgers. It's going to be tough for him to find a job, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the Jets. But as far as what I think the Colts record is going to be, they were 8-9 last year, second in the AFC South. I wouldn't really be surprised if they had a similar year. I pegged them at about 7 to 8 wins, maybe 7-10, just because we're not sure what's going to happen with their quarterback situation. If they decide to roll out Anthony Richardson, I think about 7 wins. If they go a different route, maybe get a veteran, maybe they can get to 8, maybe even 9 wins and squeeze into a wild card spot. But long way to go until then. So we'll see what they do in the offseason and as the draft and free agency gets closer and closer. But that's it for the Colts. We wrapped up the AFC South, and we're going to continue on our season outlooks right after this next break. And we're going to be starting in the AFC East and starting with the Miami Dolphins. So just stick with us. We'll be right back.
GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to the third segment in our show. We're going to continue our season outlooks, starting in the AFC East with the Miami Dolphins. and take a look at what they did. This is another 8-9 team that finished second in their division. They finished second in the AFC East behind the Buffalo Bills. And obviously they need some improvements on that Miami Dolphins team. Unfortunately for the Dolphins, Tua was hurt a good chunk of the year, which put them in a pretty big hole. And that offense was never really able to get anything going. Despite having the weapons on the outside like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, they never really clicked, especially, they had, Snoop Huntley behind center for a good chunk of the year. But when Tua did come back, there was an improvement in that offense. They have a couple good running backs still as well, Devin Etienne and, Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert may not be there next year, though, but they were a solid 1-2 punch for the Dolphins in the backfield. But overall, you take a look at what they did on offense. They were 22nd in the NFL in points per game. They only had 20.3 points per game, so just right around middle of the pack, a little bit lower than middle of the pack possibly, but depending on how you look at it. But they were not good enough on offense. They have a lot of good, talented players, skill players on that offense, but injuries definitely really hurt them this year. And, there were a lot of games that it was hard to watch just because they couldn't really get anything going. Just simply, a lot of it had to do with Tua not being there. I think that really, really hurt them. You say what you want about Tua, but he proved, I think, especially last year, that this team can only go as far as Tua can take them. If Tua's not, healthy, they don't have any chance, at going to the playoffs or doing anything. The biggest knock on the Dolphins has always been they can't play in weather when it gets under 30 degrees, and it's proven to be true. Some people may laugh at that, but I mean, it has proven to be true. They have yet to really do anything in a cold weather game, in a game that was like of really, really big importance, like in, a couple years ago when they played the Chiefs in Kansas City. That game was it was never close. It was never fair. And I mean, you could potentially just say that, oh yeah, well, that was the Chiefs, and the Chiefs won the Super Bowl that particular year. But, still, it's just another example. They had a few games last year too in cold weather that they weren't unable to win. So that's always going to be a stigma until they change that. But yeah, so the Dolphins, take a look at the rest of the team. The offense struggled a little bit, but that defense was a top 10 unit, in every category. They were top 10. They were fourth in the league in yards per game allowed. They gave up the fewest yards per game. And despite their top 10 defense, the one thing that you could kind of say was sort of a knock on the Dolphins defense, which they didn't, get a lot of takeaways. They had 10 interceptions, which was good for about 22nd in the league overall. So about middle of the pack there. Sacks, they didn't get too many sacks. I think it was about 29 sacks that they had. That was near the bottom half of the league as well. So they didn't, as good as they were at covering and, making sure tackles and things like that, there was just other little things that the defense did not do well, which kind of culminated in, some games just not really going their way. Of course, the offense was a big reason why, and the defense did all they could, but it wasn't, by all means, was not the defense's fault that they missed the playoffs and, ultimately had a losing record. It was a number of different things, but the defense could still use a little bit of improvement. They could potentially improve some of their depth in the secondary. There's a couple guys that have been, or there's one guy in particular that a lot of mocks that I've seen are kind of going with the Dolphins. The Dolphins have the 13th overall pick. Take a look at a guy like Malachi Starks from Georgia, the safety out of Georgia. That could be a player that they are interested in going in the first round with that number 13 pick. He is a very talented safety, could really bring a lot of, what the Dolphins need, which is short tackling and cover corners on the back end there, or coverage on the back end. And there's a few other guys in free agency that they could go after, maybe, for some depth pieces in corner, maybe a slot corner or something like that. There's a couple guys out there. Mike Hilton comes to mind. I keep bringing his name up because I still think that he could be a really good, solid depth guy or, slot corner for you. He's a really good blitzing corner. So I could see him going somewhere. Dolphins may want to snatch him up potentially since he is a free agent from Cincinnati now. So something that they can definitely build on. Offensive line, definitely needs to be rebuilt. The interior, especially of that offensive line, both guards, the center they're pretty much set up, but both guards are free agents. So definitely either you want to re-sign those guys or go out and get a couple of free agents, or maybe address it in the draft as well. That's a possibility. Teron Armstead is not going to return, most likely, the tackle of the Dolphins. Most likely he's going to be, set off into free agency, so we'll see, where he goes ultimately. But offensive line definitely needs to be rebuilt for the Dolphins. And, some other needs that they could potentially go in, Ronnie Stanley, if they're not going to go after Teron Armstead, if he's not going to return, Ronnie Stanley is a free agent that they could potentially sign. And maybe they draft a guy and have Ronnie Stanley start, and then the young guy will learn behind him, or if Ronnie Stanley gets hurt, he can come in and, provide some added depth, because Stanley has had some issues with injury as he's gotten into the later parts of his career. Still, solid veteran presence who could be a really good leader to a young guy. So a name to watch out for. You're probably not going to have to spend a ton of money to get him just simply because of his age. But, something to think about for the Dolphins. They've got a lot of other things that they need to do as well. Defensive line is a potential need as well, with Calais Campbell most likely going to be gone as he is a free agent as well. A guy that has come up a little bit, in some of the research I've been doing just in other teams, but, just thinking about it now, is Javon Hargrave from San Francisco. That is a very good player still. He, of course, played for the Eagles back when the Eagles went to the Super Bowl against the Patriots, won their first franchise Super Bowl. So he was on that team, and he was very good. He was originally drafted by the Steelers, and he was solid there, but the Steelers were unable to keep him just because of how good he was, how much money that he commanded. They were unable to keep him, and then he went to Philly, got even better, and then went to San Francisco. And San Francisco has just had a run of really bad injuries over the past over the past couple of years. There's been a year or two here and there where they've been pretty healthy. But for the most part, they've had a lot of these years where they've had a ton of injuries. So Javon Hargrave, free agent, somebody to look into if I'm the Miami Dolphins. If you want to shore up that defensive line, especially if Calais Campbell is not going to return, that could be a guy that could come in and immediately be a contributor for you, because he's very good at stopping the run as well, which is something that the Dolphins want to continue to be able to do. They did a pretty good job of it last year. The defense, like I said, as a whole, were top 10 in just about every single category. Highest ranking that they had was 4th, and that was in total yards per game, as we mentioned before. But solid defense, and they want to keep that, while also getting the offense up to speed. They could, like I said, go after Ronnie Stanley. Maybe they re-sign Calais Campbell, maybe they let him walk. It's going to be interesting to see what they decide to do as, free agency gets closer and closer to, ratcheting up here in the next week or so. They can rebuild that offensive line. They've still got Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on the outside. Maybe they add some tight end help, at depth. Running back's pretty set. So they've got a little bit of work to do, but I feel like this is a team that, despite them being 8-9 last year, this is a team that's right on the cusp of competing with the Bills for that division title. The Bills, of course, are the top dog and have been over the past few years. But the Dolphins are right there. They just kind of got hit with the injury bug last year. And I think if they're able to stay healthy, they could absolutely challenge the Bills for that division title. And it's going to be interesting to see if they can do that, because if they can somehow manage to get a playoff game or so at home, maybe even 2 playoff games at home, because they have the offensive talent to be able to, score a lot of points. They've just got to stay healthy. But if they can do that, they could, end up having a couple games at home, and that would benefit them greatly in the playoffs, as we've shown that anytime they go into a cold weather stadium in the playoffs, especially, they just struggle, and they end up not being really able to put up much of a fight, and they end up losing and crash out despite having decent regular seasons. I know that was the case a couple of years ago when they came out flying and ended up putting 70 points on the Broncos in a regular season game in Miami. That same year, they ended up losing to the Chiefs in the playoffs in a game in which the offense couldn't really do much of anything in a cold weather game, one of the coldest games, in playoff history. It was, very cold, and they were unable to really do anything. And Chiefs seemed much more at home than the Dolphins did. It wasn't just that the Dolphins got outplayed, but they just simply didn't look like they wanted to be playing football in that weather. And you're going to have to play football in that weather unless you get the number one seed or get a couple of, playoff games at home, depending on how seeding goes and everything. But looking at what I think their record is potentially going to be at the end of the day when it's all said and done, if they stay healthy, I think the Dolphins can sneak into the playoffs with an 11-6 record. That's what I have them right now. I could see them potentially getting higher than that because they have shown in the past that when they are healthy, that team can score a lot of points, and they're going to be tough for any team to try and stop, especially in those early months in the year when the weather is still pretty warm, But, so I've got the Dolphins at 11-6, potentially 12-5, depending on, what they do in the rest of the offseason. So that does it for the Dolphins. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Jets to close the show out. And we'll talk about everything from Aaron Rodgers to, what else is going to happen on that team with their new head coach and everything. So just stick with us, and we will be right back for our final segment of the show.
Cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
All right, guys, and welcome on back to our final segment of the day. We are going to be talking about the much talked about New York Jets. They are seemingly always in the news, and unfortunately for Jets fans, seemingly for all of the wrong reasons. Today, we're not going to get into any of the real drama or anything that usually comes with covering the Jets. We're just going to be talking about simply what they did last year and what they need to do in the offseason and what they could potentially end up at the end of the season record-wise. So taking a look at what they did last year, final record that they had was 5-12. They were third in the AFC East. Aaron Rodgers came back after that first year in New York, where he only lasted a few plays and then unfortunately had a really bad Achilles injury that ended up keeping him out for the remainder of that season. So the Aaron Rodgers New York Jets pairing had to wait one extra year. Jump forward to this year. He stays healthy all year long, actually has pretty solid numbers, statistically when you look at it. He, had 28 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, just under 4,000 yards passing. Pretty solid year when you look at just the base stats, but there were so many other things wrong with the Jets this year that kind of gloss over those numbers, because a lot of the times the Jets were playing from several scores behind, and a lot of those yardage and points and touchdowns that Aaron Rodgers was putting up were in games that, were already pretty much decided. Not to say that he was terrible all year long. He was definitely the bright spot, along with Garrett Wilson, of course, on that Jets offense. They just wasn't a great year for them, and it's looking right now like Aaron Rodgers is definitely not going to be back for a third season with the Jets. It's been made pretty clear that they're not going to keep him with the new head coach that they have, when Aaron Glenn, who actually used to play for the Jets, having him come in. He wants to start fresh, understandably, and they could maybe go after a young quarterback in the draft. Their pick is number 7 so far, or excuse me, their pick is number 7 in the draft. So we'll see if they decide to go quarterback. They could go after a potential veteran quarterback. I know there has been talk that Justin Fields could be a guy they look into. Justin Fields is, of course, still a free agent. He was with the Steelers last year. The Steelers are still in talks with trying to get him, sign and get a deal done. Just nothing has happened right now. The Jets could potentially throw more money at the situation and force the Steelers to either just, have to go a different route, or maybe up their offer, with Justin Fields. But the Jets could absolutely go after him, and, I wouldn't blame them, because when the way the NFL works now, you kind of need a quarterback that can get out of the pocket, especially with the Jets having, problems protecting their quarterbacks. You had a guy like Aaron Rodgers who used to be very mobile and, able to get away from, any types of rush or anything. I mean, nobody would call him Michael Vick or anything like that, but he was still able to move in the pocket and escape pressure and, make key runs on, long third down plays or clutch plays to get first downs. So he had that ability before, doesn't have that ability now. So they need to go after a quarterback that can move, and Justin Fields is absolutely one of those quarterbacks that can move. I personally think that Justin Fields is the best option at quarterback amongst the quarterbacks that are going to be available in the offseason here, whether it be through trades or, free agency. I feel like Justin Fields is the best option for a lot of teams that are quarterback needy, that are looking to maybe not go after a quarterback in the draft, in a draft class that is not necessarily super deep when it comes to quarterback. So the Jets could be one of those teams that go after just another guy that is, got some NFL experience. And Justin Fields has a very high ceiling, so there is that potential that he could turn out to be a Lamar Jackson type of player. He can certainly run like Lamar Jackson can. Obviously, Lamar is much better as a passer and, does a lot more things better than Justin Fields. But as far as physical ability in terms of running the ball and being elusive, Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields are probably the two best in the league at that particular part of the game, so definitely it's going to be a weapon if the Jets were able to pull him away from Pittsburgh. I ultimately still think he's going to end up in Pittsburgh, but the Jets would be fools not to at least reach out and try and talk to Justin and his people and maybe get a deal done to bring him over to New York, because you pair him with a guy like Garrett Wilson, who is a very, very talented young receiver and can make ridiculous catches, as we saw last year with the famous jump man catch that he made, which was a ridiculous catch, but he is a tremendous young receiver. Pair him with a good, solid young quarterback like Justin Fields that has the potential like Justin Fields has, and that offense could take off, especially with their running game. With Breece Hall, he's a solid running back. May not have had the best year last year, but I feel like they honestly didn't really use him as well as they should have. He didn't have the best year in terms of taking care of the ball, too, because he had 6 fumbles and he only had 5 touchdowns rushing. So that's not a stat that you want on your ledger. But I still believe that he is a good running back, and it just was not the right system, wasn't the right situation for Breece Hall last year in the midst of, changing head coaches after the first few weeks of the season. Robert Saleh was gone, and, there was talk from Woody Johnson that he even had, potentially, an inkling to maybe bench Aaron Rodgers earlier in the year. But, that's just part of all the drama that came with the Jets that I don't want to get into too much, because that's been talked about to death already, in the news. But it just kind of comes with the territory with the Jets. It's always more than just what the stats show on the stat sheet. Take a look at their defense, though. Their defense is still pretty solid. There's still a lot of good players on there. Sauce Gardner, one of the best, in the game at the defensive back position. Definitely one of the best corners in the league for sure. He only had one interception last year, but, honestly, especially in, that position at corner or just in the secondary in general, it doesn't necessarily always tell the story, when you just look at the stat sheets. It's interceptions doesn't necessarily mean that he had a bad year. He's still a very good cover corner, one of the best in the league, definitely one of the best young corners in the league, so they can still build off of that. DJ Reed is looking like he might be gone. I know we've mentioned his name a few times when talking about other teams during their season outlooks and what they could, potentially go and get. DJ Reed is definitely one of those guys. Don't know if he's going to be back. It'll be interesting to see if the Jets re-sign him. I don't think they will. So if that is the case, they're going to want to go after somebody potentially in the draft, maybe in free agency, or maybe if they can, sneak a trade from somebody after somebody makes a player available. Another player to kind of look out for the Jets that I didn't really think about, honestly, until right this second, is if they can move some money around, maybe they go after Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett has been clear that he wants to, get out of Cleveland. And if the Jets can pitch him a scenario in which their offense is going to be better because they're going to go get a really good quarterback, they've still got weapons on offense. The defense is still pretty solid. You add Myles Garrett to that defense, that could really change the outlook of the Jets, so long as, nobody is, getting hurt, like seems to be the Jets' issues, or, nobody is getting into headlines and being a distraction, which is another thing that kind of plagues the Jets a lot. But, if they can go get a guy like Myles Garrett, that could change some of their fortunes, and they could end up being one of the better teams in that division. It could really make that division a very interesting one to follow, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the Patriots tomorrow when we, finish off the season outlook of the AFC East. So the Patriots, they're a team that is also on the rise. So if the Jets can kind of hop on that same train, get a guy like Myles Garrett, improve the offense a little bit, they could, make some noise. Maybe they don't win, the division or anything like that, but could potentially sneak in as a wild card somewhere. So, it's very possible. They did let go of Davante Adams, which wasn't too much of a surprise, after Aaron Rodgers was made clear that he wasn't going to be returning. You figured that Davante Adams was going to be not that far behind him, and that was, of course, the case. They decided to just release him, so he goes in to free agency with a lot of wide receiver needy teams out there. So it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. I could think of a few teams. I know that we mentioned them when we were talking about DK Metcalf earlier in the show, but the Steelers are a team that could go after Davante Adams. The Chargers could go after Davante Adams. Cowboys is another team that could go after him. Maybe even, the Commanders. They've got the cap space, and, maybe they go after a guy like that to pair with Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel. Probably not, just because they got Deebo Samuel, but, you never know, because there have been teams in the past that have tried to load up at positions, and try and just make the most out of their offense. So it's just, it's a long shot team, I understand that, but just something to think about, with them. But if they can get a couple guys or to pair with Garrett Wilson, they're going to be pretty solid if they can get the quarterback situation sorted out, whether they go after Cam Ward or maybe even Shedeur Sanders, because Shedeur Sanders has been reportedly dropping on some teams' boards, so maybe he falls to 7. It's very possible. And if Shedeur Sanders is there at 7 when the Jets pick, it's going to be hard for me to envision a scenario in which they pass on that. They, may end up going ahead and drafting him if the ego or all the allure that comes with being Deion Sanders' son is an issue with the Jets, then it wouldn't really make sense that it would be, because they've taken on big personalities before. One of their best players in franchise history was a big personality in Broadway Joe Namath way back in the day. So I don't think that's going to be an issue, and I honestly think the whole Shedeur Sanders stuff is a bit overblown. I don't think there's really anything wrong with his attitude. I feel like a lot of teams are kind of just intimidated by the fact that his father is Deion Sanders, and maybe they don't want that attention coming to their team, thinking that Deion's going to bring a whole bunch of different stuff along with Shedeur Sanders to whatever team they decide to draft him. But I just don't see it that way. I think Shedeur Sanders, if he falls to the Jets would be foolish not to go after him. Give him a chance, especially if you're trying to bolster that receiver room. You've got a solid defense, as we mentioned on here before. So it's a place that could end up being good, especially with their new head coach in place, Aaron Glenn, who was the defensive coordinator for the Lions, but also did play for the Jets. So he's used to those surroundings. So he's a guy that could, become a really good leader, and he could help Shedeur Sanders, in that environment. So wouldn't surprise me if Shedeur fell to the Jets, that the Jets don't just draft him right there. But as far as what I think the Jets' record is going to be, it's of course all going to depend on what they decide to do at quarterback. If they say go after Shedeur Sanders, if Shedeur Sanders falls to them, or maybe they trade up to try and get him or Cam Ward, if they do something like that, I could see them maybe improving on their win total by about a game, maybe 2, maybe 6 or 7 wins. But if they go the veteran route for cheap, I would say it's probably going to be not much different, maybe about 7 wins, as a max. So I would ultimately probably say about 6-11, 7-10, something like that for the Jets. I do think they have the potential to be better than that if they get everything right in the offseason, but that's just going to depend on a lot of different factors. So, but yeah, that covers it for our show for today. I do appreciate everybody that joined me and stuck with me for the whole show. I know it was kind of a longer one, so I appreciate everybody going in and doing, any kind of questions or any comments or anything like that. I do appreciate it. And once again, guys, thank you for joining me, and we're going to see you next time. So once again, any type of support means a lot to us. Please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. Also invite you to like and follow us on Facebook, X, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to